cycle, confusion, aches and pains, respiratory illnesses. These are all the symptoms. But again, the most important one is a sense of sadness or depression. So what causes this? So this is the second topic for today. What causes it? There are probably three major causes, and they probably work together in harmony in some way. The first cause is it probably, now, this has been researched for decades now, and we still know very little about SAD. We know how to treat SAD, not cure it, but treat its symptoms, and we know what triggers it, but we don't really understand it. So the first thing is it may be genetic. It may be genetic. And if it's genetic, it was probably an adaptation of people living in extreme northern climates with extreme long winters and very short days and long nights. And so in order to survive, the survival mechanism says, it's pretty risky living in an Arctic or a subarctic or, a challenging environment like that during winter months. You're better off if you take a break. You're better off if you rest, if you go into hibernation or semi-hibernation. And probably over the millennia, people who were able to do this, who did have the symptoms of SAD and, of course, passed it on, and the symptoms maybe increased in the tribes that live there, would have a better chance of survival. And then, of course, those people, intermarried people, they themselves moved. Ice ages come and go. People move around globally like they're doing today. And so even though the prevalence seems to be higher in people with kind of northern backgrounds, not just European, Germanic, for example, would be one, but Asian, Mongolian and Turkish people, and Native Americans, and Japanese. This is all part probably of our genetic makeup. So, for example, when the native peoples crossed the ice bridge, the land bridge, from Siberia to the Americas, first people here in Americas many thousands of years ago, they eventually migrated southwards. And of course, they migrated all the way to the tropics and so forth, but they may have been carriers. And so, we don't know. We don't know exactly what the genetic makeup is, but it probably was a creative adaptation to the severity of winter, and it's probably been diffused among the peoples of the world over the thousands and thousands of years of migration. That's the first one. But that's not enough. See, that's not enough to give you SAD. The second one is constitutional. That's sort of a non-scientific term, but I'm going to use it anyway. In other words, it's your unique makeup. It's who you are, how you've been formed in the womb, how you've been nurtured early in life, and your own peculiar makeup of so many health factors. And if your constitution tends towards SAD, there's a good chance that it will happen. If, especially if something triggers it. So we'll talk about this later also, but triggering is very, very important. In other words, something happens at some point in one's life, and one has a reaction with SAD. It's very likely. So I think of my own story, and I think the doctors who examined me and heard my story would probably agree with it. And actually, I have heard agreement that yes, this may have been what happened to you, Bob Wilhelm. I have 3 children who died in infancy from a very rare genetic disease not connected with SAD called Wernicke-Hoffmann syndrome, infantile muscular atrophy. They died in their first year of life. So in my 20s, my late 20s, I went through a 5-year cycle of their being born and their dying. We had always hoped that the next child would live, but each child, each of the three, succumbed. So for 5 years, there were these births always in the wintertime, okay? And the deaths were also in the wintertime, mostly. Late autumn, early spring, to early spring. And this dealing with this dealing with the stress of it, the sadness of it, uh, uh, probably triggered this in me. Probably. We'll never know. We'll never know. So an illness can trigger it. A psychic crisis in life can trigger it. You have to look at your own life to think. You have to ask yourself, when was I aware of winter blues? And what in my life may have triggered this or made it worse? So then there's a third thing, and this is the easiest of all the three to understand because it's so scientific. The other ones, there's a lot of guesswork there, and you say it, and people raise their eyebrows and say, "Well, that sounds like it's a crazy theory." The third one is environmental. So there's a genetic component, most likely. There's a constitutional component, a physical, psychic component based on our individuality, our own unique body, mind. And then environmental. And environmental is the surroundings that we are in. And the most important aspect of that is where we live in the globe. How far are we from the equator? How close are we to the poles? And the further in the northern hemisphere, of course it's reversed in the southern, but in the northern hemisphere, if you live in the Caribbean, if you live in South Florida, if you live in Mexico, you're going to be okay. Or you'll have a very low incidence of SAD. Now, you live in Canada, you live in Alaska, you live in the northern tier of states, Minnesota, New York, Massachusetts, Washington State. You're going to have a severe impact. So the statistics are pretty simple. They've done research on this, and people who live, let's say in Boston, maybe there's an 11%, or I'm not sure now, there have been different surveys, let's say 10, 11, 12% of the people have SAD, not just the winter blues, they have SAD, serious case of SAD. You go to Florida, and you go to Orlando, you go to Miami, and it's 1%. So in other words, you have to be really, really sensitive to the symptoms of SAD and have a severe case of SAD to have this in the tropics. So we'll talk about that later. So look, it's these three things that affect your status as having the winter blues, if it's mild, to having seasonal affective disorder, if it's severe. It's why people migrate, why people become snowbirds in the wintertime and go to where the sun is. So the last thing I want to talk about in this opening is that you notice I'm wearing a white coat here. It's not because I'm a medical doctor, I'm not. My doctorate is in the performing arts and as a teacher and as a storyteller. And I've been trained as a therapist, but I am not licensed as a therapist. And I'm wearing white. My wife always reminds me. She says you can't wear white after Labor Day. This is an old tradition in the Northeast of the United States. So you wear your summer whites, and then you put them away when Labor Day comes, and you move into autumn colors and muted colors and darker colors. So today's Labor Day, and so I'm wearing white. I don't think you'll see me wearing white again unless I make a video when I'm in Florida during the winter, because of course in the subtropics and the tropics you can wear white all year round. So let's look at the calendar. Let me give you a very brief suggestion on how to kind of gauge your SAD. And the way to gauge it is to see when your first symptoms appear. And all of a sudden you're feeling a little groggy, your energy level's down, you don't want to get up in the morning, you can't sleep at night, you're starting to eat a little more than you should, especially if it's carbohydrates, and yeah, sometimes you're not feeling bad. Well, it's not really that you're depressed, but there are days when you get a feeling of the blues. So in North America, we can follow this with a series of holidays, except for the first one. So I'm going to go through the holidays, and I'm going to ask you, as you think about your past life and watch it this year, when do you start noticing the first symptoms? They won't all come together at the same time. They'll creep in very, very subtly. And sometimes you won't notice till a couple of weeks later. You say, "Oh, I've been down and out for the last 4 weeks. I didn't even know it." It helps to have a friend or a family member remind you that you're in SAD. And that's what I rely on. My wife tells me she knows before I do when SAD has impacted me. So the first one is not in our holiday calendar. It happens very early. It happens the 1st of August.